Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my guest from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Hi, Arnie. Good to be with you again.
No worries. Pleased to have you, Robert. And off screen, we actually mentioned Wally amongst us. But just for those who are interested, how's Wally going?
Well, he's had a fairly minor operation, and he has uh, recovered. I think he's recovering fine from that, but he does have a bit of confusion alternating with times of lucidity.
Hmm.
So it's a strange alternation in his mental state, and he's going to be in the hospital for a few days. So I'm hoping that they will do an analysis that reveals why he is having this inconsistency in his mental capacity.
No worries.
But
Well,
he was in the hospital, and from what I understand, he blasted all the staff on the subject of COVID. So good for him. He got a little bit of his
uh,
coherence going there.
excellent,
So he
excellent.
has
Well,
quite a reputation with the doctors.
that's excellent, excellent. Yeah, because my mother is she's about Wally's age, and in her state of health, yeah, there is cognitive decline, but at times she is as sharp as a pen, and she's onto it and she's into it, and she certainly contributes to the general discussion. And the general discussion is around the lockdown. The general discussion is around politics. It's around COVID, whether it's medical or it's political, and all those sorts of things. And she certainly has opinions to place on the floor, and I really appreciate her input, the wisdom of years. Anyway, Robert, I'm
As you
going.
get older, you're supposed to have a better take on the generality of things.
Wow.
So you're not so much preoccupied with detail. That
Yeah.
is a common perception anyway.
Okay.
And surely that's a valuable thing to have.
Absolutely,
That
because it's to me that
opinion overview.
yeah, the overview. That's interesting because it's the work of, in my understanding, Dr. Ian McGilchrist and the divided brain and the making of the Western world. He is a forerunner in regard to identifying the process of actually how we think. And there is a process. It's not like it's polarity, it's left hemisphere or right hemisphere. It's actually we take we take a view of the world in. And in particular, we might look in detail at something and place it in the left hemisphere thinking, but the left hemisphere then has to place it back to the right hemisphere into that overview. How does it actually outwork in society, in the world? That process is fundamental. McGilchrist, he's actually coming out with two new books in November, I think it is, October, November. I think it's November in Britain, and then for world release after that. And I'm certainly looking forward to it because to me, what we're looking at in detail in regard to COVID, we can look at the points of it. Each point argue a point, but in the end, you've got to look at the overview. What effect is it having on society? And on that basis, Robert, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Arnie. Well, what effect it's having on society is not being evaluated in a very balanced way, is it? Because all we hear is we have to get the vaccination numbers up. It's a theme that they have been harping on incessantly, and no matter what other influences or deterioration is caused in society by these uh, COVID strictures, it just doesn't get into the news. It's just the need to get the vaccination numbers up. And when you think of when this whole thing started, and we were going to have a sort of, I think, a distancing only program and being shut in a bit for 2 weeks, and then you look at where we are now, and the whole thing has been just a continual inching ahead. We give them a concession, and it's just the basis for the next concession. And if you do the timeline of all these things, you can see it has very much the appearance of something that's been calculated from the outset. And they knew if they could just get us into the program, get us in a cooperative mood, then they could push us and push us. And finally, they've got us in a real trap. Now in Canada, for example, I'm sure it's the same elsewhere, they're projecting a big return of COVID in the fall. And I saw a headline today. It was modeling shows Canada could see 15,000 daily cases by October if COVID is not controlled. Well, in the first place, I think the fact that animals are now shown to be reservoirs for COVID makes this whole exercise a joke, because there's no way you're going to be vaccinating all the animals to make sure they're not carriers of COVID. So it's a stupid exercise in the first place. But look at this headline. It says modeling shows. Our whole lives now are being governed by the imaginings or the mathematical calculations, I guess, of some alleged statisticians. It's not related to anything real. It's all these projections, all these estimates. And yet our lives are being dominated by what so-called health authorities, I think they're probably the least expert medical people in the country, but they're dominating our lives with these silly projections. And they can always say that they justify their measures on this basis. They can always increase the numbers, can't they? And they've been doing it unrelentingly for a year and 3 quarters. So, and then they don't talk about anything now but cases. And there are lots of doctors who say a medical case is someone who is ill. Now, they're not talking about people who are ill. They're talking about people who test for having something in their systems. And this something in their systems, if the test is even finding that, which is doubtful, because if you know anything about the PCR test, you know it's subject to very serious flaws. It produces a lot of false information. But the fact they're cases, well, how do they get case numbers? I think only if they were doing on a regular basis a testing of the entire population would there be any meaning whatsoever in comparing case numbers, because all they have to do is increase the number of people being tested. And if you know that they're finding a certain percentage of people with this alleged virus in their bodies, then they're going to get more cases. So if we're going to have 15,000 daily cases by October, I suspect they're going to be intensifying their testing program. And this is how they go about this. And it is so patently manipulation. Can't understand why people don't clue into it. It doesn't make any sense. Cases. So there's also never any explanation of how these numbers have been arrived at. We just have public health officials or maybe politicians stand up and spout the numbers, but they don't ever provide any documentary basis, any studies, any scientific analysis that we can refer to see if we concur with their opinions about what's happening regarding COVID. It's an absolute scandal, and yet they get away with it persistently. I saw an interview of a fellow in Britain who is a very, I don't know if it was a minister, but somebody who was a very big COVID counselor anyway, and he was announcing the prospects for COVID getting worse. And also, I think he was talking about the program to vaccinate teenagers aged 12 to 15 or something like that. Anyway, he made this declaration, and surprisingly, there was actually a reporter on the scene who asked an intelligent question. a somewhat probing question. It was a fellow, and he said, "When can we expect to see the studies and reports that you're basing this announcement on?" And this guy was completely flustered. And his answer was, "Well, we don't actually have those reports. We intend to publish something before long, but we have been in contact with some medical experts in other countries." And this was the basis for their policy announcement. It was utterly pathetic. You could see right away that it was just a pure fabrication, and that their policy was based on thin air. Nothing there. They're just making all these announcements all the time, but never providing any sort of analytical or documentary justification for them. Because the population is assumed, I guess, to be just passive. They've got no capacity for analysis, no capacity for thinking on their own. So they don't bother giving us the rationale for the policies they're imposing. But these policies have proven to be so disastrous and calamitous, we should be insisting on getting the justifications for them, shouldn't we? It's long overdue.
No worries. Thank you for that, Robert. Excellent opening salvo. And I'm going to cut across to some websites just to reinforce the points that Robert has just made. Firstly, we go to CBC News, which is the Canadian-based, and there's the article in regard to targeting 85% vaccine rates, and of course will exceed the third wave by October. So this is one of the articles that Robert is referring to, and I'm thinking, how do we actually begin to decipher the medical ramifications of what's actually being said? How do we re-educate ourselves? How do we actually begin to think in regard to validity of PCR tests, of the vaccine mRNA? It's not a vaccine, it's an mRNA injection, the efficacy of it, and its effectiveness. Where do we go? And I'm thinking the least I can do for our audience is start to walk you through some of what I consider reliable websites of information. Dr. Joseph McCullough, he has been actually consistently presenting a case about it, and he continues on a daily basis, or actually it's every 2 days. Every 2 days he will change over his website and update it with more information, not only about the COVID injection efficacy, but how to actually manage seasonal flus, how to actually manage if you think you've got COVID. What can you actually do? And there is information on it, and also, of course, the political ramifications. In this case, the enhances delta infectivity. So it's actually not only is the injection not necessarily the best tack to take, it may actually be compounding the effect of variances of other varieties of COVID, and actually enhancing them to be more sinister. It's not a pretty thought when you think that the vested interests in this whole narrative, of course, are Big Pharma. And if Big Pharma actually stands to gain not only billions, trillions of dollars in sale of their products, but also power over the whole world. And so, to me, most important. Another website I go to is Dr. Judy Weilerman, an Australian woman. I'm fortunate to have met her. And she produces a regular newsletter, and the history of the 2021 newsletters are there. You can go to her historical newsletters. So she's been at this for 12, 13 years now, producing it. So her information is there. And of course, she actually wrote her PhD was in regard to the immunisation policy of the Australian government. And her PhD you can actually get on her website. You can also get it on our website, her documents. I find her a reliable and consistent source of information about the efficacy of vaccines, in particular mRNA, the injection policy, the actual vaccination schedule for our children, and the inordinate influence that Big Pharma has over our government. Very, very important to take into account what she's actually saying, so that you can at least be aware of what she's saying. You may not agree with it, that's fine, but if you don't agree, do it on the basis of knowledge, not just that's her view and that's it. I'm going to turn away from that. That's not knowledge. That's not knowledge. Do your own research. Do your own investigation. Another website I go to, and I know that Mike Adams is at times inflammatory, but he's actually also a reliable source of a lot of information. And in this instance, the booster shots. So don't think that 1 or 2 COVID shots is the end position. It's not. Once, as Robert said, once they've got you accepting the narrative, there is no end in sight. And this is how indoctrination works. This is how Hitler could come to power, because he started off small, but he continued. It was the building of the Reichstag building, the burning of that. That was the justification. That was the trigger. And then, of course, over the next 5 years, he built that into a complete and total dictatorship. To bring about, in the end, it was really World War. And if you read Anthony Sutton's books on that, you'll find that that dictatorship was sponsored by big American firms and big American banks. And they were responsible for financing. The cartels were responsible for developing what came out of obscurity, which was the Nazi Party. Up till 1933, it wasn't even on the radar. And here it was. It worked its way into dictatorship and took over that whole nation for them to expand their control over other nations, and of course leading into the World War. So don't think what we're experiencing is unprecedented. It is not. It is part of a pattern. Patrick Wood, another website I go to, although not as often as I used to, but Patrick Wood on technocracy, and he will bring you up to date in regard to the, say, the Club of Rome, the World Economic Forum, in this case Bank of International Settlements, talking about digital currencies. So he's, again, you start piecing together some of these websites, and you'll actually build a good, strong case of at least thinking, of at least different types of thinking than the mainstream media. Now, I wanted to cut across to the Sydney Morning Herald. I consider Sydney Morning Herald a left-wing newspaper, similar to our ABC, and just show you something on this that I saw. And this is my take on it, right across the front. The first is that vaccine passports are presented to the positive, to be issued in weeks to prepare for flights resuming. So the vaccine passports and the flights resuming, returning to normality with internal papers of your medical status. That's what's actually being proposed, and this is actually done in a positive light. It's done in a positive light. So the left-wing media are in agreement with Bill Gates. Don't think they're not. They are in agreement with the World Health Organization and with Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum. And of course, if you like, we look at anyone who's a naysayer. This is a good article here in the sense that the headline says this Liberal MP is ridiculous, because this Liberal MP is calling for the loosening of restrictions in Sydney. Now, the Liberal MP, I believe in New South Wales, the Liberals are in charge of the government. That organised criminal entity called the Liberal Party, which of course uses the seat of power for its own direct benefit. And here it is, someone decides to stand up outside of their party, and the paper calls them ridiculous. Starts with ridiculous. So name calling, not based on anything else other than there is only one policy, and this policy has to be endorsed. And of course, this policy is all about this one here, COVID-19. It's all about pushing vaccine rates. This is the latest. This is the cases, etc., etc., etc. Now, you've got to bear in mind that in these media reports, there's no noise at all about the massive, massive increases in youth suicide. There's no noise at all about the massive, massive amount of individuals now seeking government assistance. I mentioned that there was 50 to 60,000 businesses were going to go broke. I mentioned that a month or two ago. Well, I've received reports like just last week, 420,000 more Australians are seeking government assistance across the 6 weeks. And most of them are in the eastern states. It doesn't even get a Guernsey on this paper. Doesn't even get a Guernsey. So what is this paper doing? It's giving you one narrative, while these others, suicide rates, bankruptcies, job losses, the economy, don't get a Guernsey. Epoch Times is essentially a counter. They argue that they are a counter to the Chinese Communist Party. That's okay, but I still have my reservations because I don't believe on a lot of things they go far enough. They highlight what's wrong, but they stop at that point. In this case, okay, Justin Trudeau, he's in election campaign mode in Canada, and he had gravel thrown at him. So obviously it's a bit of self-righteousness on his part, give him a determined look, a photo that sort of, that glare that he looks at the challenges against him, he's standing up against it, and he condemns them. Angry mobs, he calls them. Angry mobs. Angry that what? They've lost their job, that they've lost their home, that they're going to be injected with a genetically modifying chemical arrangement into their body under compulsion, and he gets stoned. I think that's just the least of it. The least of it. Here we go with theconversation.com. Facebook and Twitter can now be quietly modified by government under new surveillance laws. This is Australian surveillance laws. This is within Australia, and the privacy laws are gutted in court ruling on what is personal information. So those to me are sort of, if you like, just websites of interest, of consideration, of building the whole narrative. What are we actually trying to do on this show? More than anything else, is to encourage you to educate, encourage you to actually deconstruct the indoctrinating narrative that you have had imposed on you in your education, in your exposure to the mainstream media, whether it's in newspapers or the radio, or it's through whatever audio-visual it is, whether it's computer screen or TV time, whatever. These inordinate influences over your mind, and to me the only way to deconstruct that imposed narrative is actually to turn them all off and take a step back and have a look and have a look. I do every so often. I'll take a step back. I'll actually have a look outside, and because I'm a beekeeper, I'm quite keenly aware of the state of nature, and I see that the spring blossoming is well and truly underway. The honey flow, if you like, the nectar flow from the trees, predominantly the trees in Australia, are the big providers of nectar, which we get our honey from. And that flow has started. The bees are laying up, so they're anticipating it. They're actually laying up means that they're building the numbers in the hive. They're actually producing a lot more eggs, the queen is, in anticipation of a good season. A relatively good season. I know that the grain production in South Australia in particular is brilliant. It's in an excellent condition. And providing we have a month of dry in December, the harvest will be plentiful. The rains are not excessive. It's not as if it's wet, but the rains are plentiful. They're sufficient. And providing we have the dry, the harvest will be plentiful. So you start looking at that and you look at the real world and you say, well, Okay, the real world is that everything looks in order. Now let's take a step back from the narrative of climate. Let's take a step back. And in Australia, we're coming out of winter. It's September, so we're in spring. And has the climate been exceptional? And you look at it and you think, well, actually, no, it hasn't. The winter was not particularly cold. The rains came, but it wasn't particularly cold. The previous summer, was it so dreadful? Well, no, actually, the previous summer was nothing like dreadful, and either was the summer before. So what we're experiencing, this is by taking a step back. You've got to think it through, not listen to the propaganda, but think it through. What we're experiencing in the real world is that the world is on an even keel, a relatively even keel. But what we are experiencing that is completely disproportionate is the propaganda. What we're experiencing is the propaganda. The level of concern initially, people were really frightened about COVID, and so they essentially hid under their tables. They were given a lot of financial inducement to hide under their tables all across last year. And so they did, and then they surfaced at the later part of the year. In Australia they surfaced because that's our summer, and okay, things sort of got back to normal across the Christmas and New Year. But then it started again. And the second year starts again with essentially the same narrative. The numbers are building, but instead of Victoria locking down for more than 200 days, it's now New South Wales and Victoria and a little bit of Queensland. And so you look at that, and a little bit of South Australia. And so you look at that and you're thinking, okay, that's the narrative. It's an escalation. Where last year masks were not necessarily mandatory, but they were recommended, whereas this year businesses have got masks as mandatory. You can't go into a business, at least this is my experience, of those businesses that are not shuttered up and closed down forever. The businesses that are left, the supermarkets, masks are mandatory. So last year it was sort of almost voluntary but recommended, whereas this year you can't get in. So you start to build, this is the real narrative. You're taking a step back, you're actually looking at what has transpired. And these are really, really important considerations, because last year there was no vaccine push, but this year, not only is it masks, but there's this huge push on to get vaccinated. And that's the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. The vaccine numbers, the vaccine numbers, the vaccine numbers. If it's not COVID tests, it's vaccine numbers. Now, who benefits from the COVID tests? Who benefits from the vaccine numbers? Who? Who actually benefits? The same organisations that are advocating this policy. So they have a direct and vested interest in it. A direct and vested interest in it. They want you to be vaccinated. They want you to be tested. They want you to wear the masks, because it's all part of the entire narrative. They're actually marketing something. While they're marketing their products, they're also marketing complete control over their market. And you are their market. You, as part of the world, are their market. And so if you're like big pharma, big government, ultimately behind them both is big finance. And that's the tool that's being used to control you. And I will make a point. There was one website there, Technocracy News, and it talked about central bank digital currency. This is the end game. The end game of this whole narrative is that the central banks will issue currency for the whole world. And that currency will be a digital currency, and it will be tied in to carbon offsets or carbon credits, if you like. In other words, you're going to be controlled, totally controlled, and you won't be able to work without a vaccine passport that's up to date. That means you get your regular shot, whether it's every 5 months or whatever. You won't be able to work or use power in your home if you've used too much power through your carbon credits. and you'll be issued with digital currency, so it's sufficient for you to survive. This is a very sinister intent behind this whole purpose, but that's what it's about. Now, Jeremy Lee spoke of this 30 years ago when he talked about the public-private partnerships through the United Nations. Public-private partnerships. Now, the World Health Organization is not part of the UN as such. It is heavily influenced by people such as Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci. But also, inordinate power over the World Health Organization is the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So you've got to consider who's actually in the end pulling the strings. You don't hear of where is the Parliament, the United Nations? When are they meeting and discussing these things? They actually don't. They don't. The World Health Organization, which has vested interest in the outcome, is directing traffic in regard to vaccines, vaccine passports, masks, and PCR tests. They are directing traffic on it, and they are the same vested interest who actually derive benefit. These are not easy subjects to consider, but that's the narrative. And education, if you're going to at least want to come out of this, and when I say the indoctrination spell, if you want to come out of it, the only way is to actually deliberately start to educate yourself. And there's ample information if you're prepared to do it. And those websites that I directed you to, on a daily basis, they can actually assist your thinking so that the haze of today's scenario, today's lockdown totalitarian scenario, can actually be deconstructed. Those are my thoughts, my opening salvo. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, I think that people have become quite complacent. We had an extended period of peace, and we've had generally prosperity, and we've had the exercise of a lot of freedom, a lot of international travel, and therefore people don't want to consider the possibility that these things could be terminated. But it certainly looks as if they have been terminated, and it looks as if they could be terminated on a more or less permanent basis. There seems to be, I don't know about Australia and Canada, there seems to be a war on vehicular traffic, car traffic. The streets are being broken off for bicycle traffic. And I find an irony in this because I went to China in 2006 and I noticed that everybody was riding a bicycle. And in Canada, everybody was driving a car. And now if you go to China, there are cars everywhere. But in Canada, people are riding bicycles. I don't have anything against riding bicycles. It's good for your health. But Canada is a strange place to encourage that. They are altering the road system on a permanent basis. And here we have winter for 6 months in the year. You know, probably bicycle traffic goes down to 1,000th of what it is in the summer. And yet the whole traffic system is designed to accommodate it. It shows the insanity of bureaucrats. And recognizing the insanity of bureaucrats is a good reason for being leery of all this pressure to establish government in global institutions, because these institutions will have no input from the public whatsoever. They're just going to be bureaucrats discussing things among themselves, maybe just getting their orders from some hidden authority, and then they'll be issuing edicts. And this is the future of the world unless this pressure to transfer national sovereignty to these institutions is combated and reversed. We're at a critical point in human history when the importance of the individual is going to be shrunken to such a point that they will have no influence on anything at all of any importance. And this is what the this alleged Great Reset is all about. I heard just the other day, or maybe today it was, that there's a term in Marxist theory. It is year zero. And you can see that our institutions are under attack in every way. They're tearing down statues, and they're telling little kids that they can choose their gender and all this sort of stuff. The attacks are coming in waves relentlessly. And the whole effect of these is to shatter all our understanding of traditional successful ways of doing things. And this concept of year zero is that you start over. You get rid of everything in the past. And this has been tried. I mean, it was tried in communist countries. This is what the basis of the Cultural Revolution in China was under Mao. It was what happened in Cambodia under Pol Pot. The same kind of thing. Wherever they've had a communist revolution, they've tried to erase the memory of what went before. And so I think this concept of year zero is very important. And I think it's also very interesting that it's practically identical to the Great Reset, which is what the great financial interests are promoting. So you have, as we've seen so often in history, an alignment of the policy of communism with the policy of the great financial powers in the world. They just have different terms for the same thing, but their game is to erase our memory of what we valued in the past and our conviction about our achievements of the past. We have some wonderful cultural and, well, lots of material achievements too, but the cultural ones are even more interesting. The protections that we developed for personal freedom and that sort of thing. These are all going to go by the boards. And I know people like to be comfortable and they don't like to have to think about these things. But if they don't, their children and grandchildren are going to grow up in a completely different world in which their exercise of initiative and their personal development and their ability to have input into how society is evolving will be virtually non-existent. So unfortunately, because we're at this crisis point, we've been brought there because the financial power has been running a racket based on a flaw in the price system, which fails to deliver to the population the output of technological progress. They failed to do this, and they were getting to a point where with the internet and telecommunications and so on, it was possible to expose their game. So I think really they've recognized this, and they've decided that they have to clamp down and make sure their control over populations is basically absolute. And this is what the surveillance society is going to be all about. And what Arnie mentioned there, the revolution in monetary system and digital currency and all this sort of thing, where you will have no ability to have something that allows you to buy that isn't issued by the government, which is observing your behavior and awarding or punishing you on the basis of what they think is desirable. So here we stand on the threshold of a new world, and it's going to be a very sad world. If you think of what conditions were like 2 years ago, the abilities you had to associate with people, to speak your mind, to travel, and you see what we have today. Now they alternately tighten and relax the controls, but it's a sure thing they're going to tighten the controls. And they always come up with a new excuse for it. Arnie was mentioning that they're now demanding an 85% vaccination rate. Well, I remember when they were saying if they got a 70% vaccination rate, that would constitute herd immunity, and it would be enough. They could stop all this controlling of the population. But now they want an 85% vaccination rate, and the authorities are saying this won't mean that we don't have to wear masks and social so-called distance. They just increase and increase their demands, and people have acquiesced in it. And now we find that we're in a real fix because they've taken us so far that it's going to be hard to undo the progress they've made and to recapture something of the form of life we used to enjoy. A remarkable feature of this is that there is no debate. I remember when I was a young man, there were debates all the time. There were debates in school. There were parliament. There were junior parliaments when brighter students would get up and pretend to be different parties. Debate was recognized as a very desirable activity. Well, there is no more debate. If somebody opens their mouth with a dissenting view, they're going to be hammered down. It's unbelievable. You should be wanting to hear alternative views because this tempers your own. But we're not in that environment anymore. Now everything is absolute, and everything is, as they say, binary. It's either good or it's bad, and if you say the wrong thing, they will very readily tag that label of bad on you. We've seen the recent developments too with the failure of the vaccines to deliver the promise that was made for them, well, nearly 2 years ago by Bill Gates. The vaccine is going to solve our problems. Well, it's turning out that the vaccine is not preventing infection, if that is genuine. In any case, the testing is so dubious that you never know. It doesn't prevent transmission. And the idea that was being bruited a while ago was that it would at least diminish the seriousness of your symptoms or your results if you contracted COVID. But now we're hearing that the majority of people who are actually dying of COVID in some localities have been double vaccinated. So why in the world are they insisting on this continuing policy of vaccinating everybody? It's been a very disappointing program. I guess what it does is it sets you up for an unending sequence of booster shots for the rest of your life. Well, if you want that, you go for it. But I don't think it's something that we should want for ourselves or for our progeny. It's really... another thing, they keep talking about this vaccination rate, but it doesn't take into account the fact that they allege that a lot of people have had COVID. And practically every medical authority, even the ones favoring vaccination, admit that if you develop immunity through exposure to COVID, you have a much better immune reaction. That it's longer lasting, it's stronger. It's been proven that the vaccines are waning in efficacy within, 3 or 4 months. So, but what are the numbers of people who've been exposed to COVID and have developed their own antibodies to it? These numbers are not taken into account. They just say we have to vaccinate 85% of the population. And when they get 85%, they'll just say, not good enough, we need 90%. And Bill Gates said, we need 100%. So I think he's the one who established the goal way back when we started out with 2 weeks of staying in our homes and not getting too close to other people. The end game was prescribed by him, and now we're approaching it. And they're still promoting this vaccination despite all the evidence that it is of dubious effectiveness, and all the evidence that if we had just allowed people, healthy people, to be exposed to this virus, if it be a new virus, I don't know, but we would all be immune today. We would have herd immunity, and some sort of special measures could have been taken to protect people who were in a more vulnerable state of health. But here we are. It's a mad world, absolutely a mad world, in which nothing makes sense. But this is another thing we should bear in mind. Nothing is intended to make sense, because part of their program of rendering us impotent is to render us incapable of logical thought. And that is why we have this cognitive dissonance everywhere. Listen to the information coming your way and try to rationalize it, try to make it cohere, make it consistent in some way. You cannot do it logically. This is a deliberate attack on our rationalization of our reasoning, and it is part of the Great Reset, also known by the communists as Year Zero, when we start from nothing and we rebuild the world along the lines of these people who think that they can replace all history and, in fact, substitute for God.
Thank you for that, Robert. That's quite profoundly put. I want to cut across for those that are capable of reasoning, for those that are capable of thinking, and just start to look at what is the truth of the situation. In my opinion, let's see if you agree with me. This is the daily report that comes from the Australian Government Department of Health. This is for the 7th of September. There it is, 7th of September is down there. The area I want to concentrate on is the actual the death figures. Let's have a look. The death figures for identified as COVID. If we take those from 70 and above, and we look at these numbers here, really if you just had a demarcation of anyone who is 70 and above needs to be more cautious about illness, seasonal flu, and perhaps these numbers will get down. But in actual fact, anyone from 70 above is more likely to die anyway, because that's when people die. That's when they die. I mean, that's not rocket science. That's when people die. You start to look at the statistics for when people die, and that's when they die. So it's no different. With or without COVID, it's no different. This is when people die. When they get old, they die. It really is very, very important to recognise that. These are the reported case numbers, and that is that it's in regard to the PCR test. The World Health Organization shows you, there it is there, that the PCR test at high CT cycles to be potentially 100% false positive. This is Judy Weilerman. There it is. That's it there. The World Health Organization declares that it is potentially 100% false positive by the PCR test. So in other words, the World Health Organization, this is at the center of the chart, says that these numbers are garbage. The World Health Organization says they're garbage. How are we supposed to take them? So then we say, okay, the current cases, these are actually people that are in intensive care units or they're admitted to hospital. So in New South Wales, we've got 1,100 people currently in New South Wales hospitals. But the rest of the states, honestly, let's be serious about it. We're talking states of 7 million here. All right, 7 million. These numbers are not excessive. The total morbidity for last year, I think, was 910. I think it was 910 up till the end of 2020. So we've lost how many here? Honestly, 143. We've lost 143 people, and this is 2021. We've lost 143 elderly people. This is 2021, and the entire country is crippled. In this whole narrative that I'm attempting to actually just show you, is that when you go in and have a look, after you've stepped back and had a look at the world, and then you go in and have a look at actually not the computer models, because they're always working on computer models. Now, the computer models gave us climate change. The computer models, remember the J-curve? Remember Al Gore? The J-curve, the thread of everything, and Al Gore bought this huge mansion on the beachfront with rising tides and global warming. He bought this huge mansion, $10 million mansion or something, on the beachfront. He wasn't afraid of rising tides. He wasn't afraid at all of what he was espousing. What he was doing was marketing a product. The product was fear, and it was fear about climate. Now, if we take a step back from it. Go and have a look outside. Is it so onerous that we can't manage it through normal daily life? Climate? Is it so onerous? Is it so, honestly, ask the question, is it so bad? And has the change, and this is really the piece that comes together, in my view, in the previous 18 months of COVID lockdown, of industry being shut down, especially across the Western world, by shutting industry down, we have reduced our carbon footprint. So much so that it's virtually negligible. Industry, we're not producing the mass production that we've had in the past. We're actually at home. We're not using anywhere near the hydrocarbons in our cars and transport systems, all that sort of stuff. We've got this really small carbon footprint. Has the climate changed in the last 18 months? Because when you start to reason these things in your mind's eye, observe it in nature, you're stepping back to observe. This is the theory. The theory is this is what's going to happen. Climate's going to change. The oceans are going to rise. There's going to be mass flooding. There's going to be mass heat stress events. There's going to be all this fear. All these outcomes, the Chicken Little, sky is falling. But in actual fact, what are we looking at? What are we looking at? That's why we need to wake up. That's why we need to actually start considering the truth. What is the truth? What is the truth? Jesus warned us that the truth will set you free. So what is the truth? Is the world coming to an end? No. Is the climate of such a degree of variability that it becomes uninhabitable for us to live here? The answer is no. We actually adapt. I've got a jumper on. The variability between one day and the next, a few days ago it was 10 degrees cooler than it is today as a maximum temperature. 10 degrees. I just put a jumper on. And I'm actually going to take it off because it'll be too warm as the day warms up. It's going to get up to low to mid-20s. Look out. I'm used to the desert. It was low to mid-40s in the desert. So let's put it in perspective. Let's be realistic. Let's take a step back. Let's take a breath. Let's start thinking. We need to. If we're going to unravel this narrative, if we're going to look our politicians in the eye, if we're going to support that one politician who decided to say we don't need this lockdown, one politician, and they were labelled by the mainstream media as ridiculous. That's how dominant the media is over us. That's how encroaching the propaganda is against anyone who's dissenting. This whole narrative is exactly the same model as Germany, the same model as Germany was 1933 or preceding that. I'm going to walk you through our websites. I think it's so important that you arm yourself with information. We've got libraries under here. There's video libraries, there's podcast libraries, there's New Times, our blogs, podcast videos are there. Veritas Books, we sell books. But the two libraries, I think, important, these two, plus the actionist corner there. I want to go here just to the PDF library and bring it up and see we've got Solzhenitsyn. We've also got Anthony Sutton, Harvard University professor. And he wrote these books. He wrote them. Wall Street and the Bolsheviks, Wall Street and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I think it is, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and this one in particular, the Rise of Hitler, but Western technology and Soviet economic development. I think in one of these books, I think it was that one, it showed that all the shipping of the Russian military, the Navy, all the shipping had engines designed and manufactured in the West. All of them, the engines. So the heart of their Navy was built in the West. This is the type of technological transfer that's gone across. Hitler was all about cartels, American cartels in particular. Oil, Standard Oil, was in the middle of it. I used to work for them. And I was in a sense, I was frustrated because I found them, for me, a benevolent company. But the history of it is quite sordid. And in there, Anthony Sutton highlights the actual involvement, the direct involvement of the American cartels and, of course, the American finance, Wall Street mostly, in the building up, the rearming of Nazi Germany. This is vitally important. It's important because that's real history. It's not comfortable reading these things to think that this sort of treachery is going on. But otherwise, if you don't start considering it, then your position is naive. Your position is clouded and obscure. History becomes, it's lost all meaning. Oh, the king did this on that date and there was a war on that date. But if you don't actually look at the causes of war, if you don't actually look at what actually triggered the war, what was the pursuit of it? I find it interesting in the sense of the revolution in Britain, Oliver Cromwell, and a bloke from Holland with an invading army of 25,000 and 150-something, basically modern-day battleships, ancient-day battleships. This bloke invaded England, and they called it the Glorious Revolution. He invaded England. If you like, the level of corruption, the level of treachery within the government of the day, within the Admiralty, within the administration, they white-handed the king. And then he ended up fleeing the country. He was captured, but it was better that he actually left so that William of Orange could claim the throne. A Dutchman could claim the throne. Why would you want a Dutchman to claim the throne of England? It was because he would pursue a policy that suited those people that were working behind the scenes. And those people behind the scenes were merchants. They were bankers. And of course, not long after William of Orange, the establishment of the Bank of England, a central bank for that nation, and the beginning of the national debt. And up till that point, that national debt started at that point. Britain, England has never, ever been out of debt. Never, ever. Now, in contrast to First World War, Australia had its own bank. We called it the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. It was founded in 1911. It opened its doors in 1912 under the governorship of Sir Denison Miller. Now let's go back. Let's go back again. I'll walk you through, and this is really important. I'll walk you through where I've just built up a small section that will help you. Under the story of the Commonwealth Bank, Amos, the story of the Commonwealth Bank is there. That's a brilliant little book, and that will take you through what actually transpired. But you've also got other books which I think are really, really important. And this is actually the Commonwealth Bank here by Faulkner is really, really important. I've got a copy of that book. It was printed 1924 and it's available to you. You can click on it. It'll bring it up. There's the front cover and it takes you through 400 pages of the history. This was actually commissioned by the Commonwealth Bank itself. And there's the Sir Denison Miller, the governor, and it'll actually take you through what actually transpired in the history of that bank, what it actually did. When Australia came out of the First World War, 1919, that bank was 7 years old. It had opened its doors for 7 years. The CBA Bank had financed the Australian war effort, and we came out of that war debt-free. Debt-free. We were, on the day the war was concluded, we were debt-free. We had paid for that war with our effort, our raw materials, and what I describe as blood, sweat and tears of the Australian people. We had paid for it. And Sir Denison Miller, as operating the bank as a people's bank, agreed. And all the debts were forgiven. And it really is important to recognise that the idea of a war effort is that loans are issued, but as the war is executed, those loans should be cancelled out. And that's exactly what he did. Those loans were cancelled out because all the purpose of the financial system was to make financially possible what was physically possible. Really, really important. What we can do physically needs to be made financially possible. And that's what Sir Denison Miller did. He actually opened up if you like, a living example of what a financial system can do if it's actually directed correctly to work through for the benefit of the community. Now, what we're seeing with this great reset, with Klaus Schwab, with Bill Gates, with the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, the Bank of International Settlements, these are the top of the pyramid of this power structure. What you're actually seeing is that they want to, by subterfuge, control the whole world. And they're doing it through the fraud of credit creation. Really, really important that we look at this, we consider it. And it's never going to happen unless you choose to do something about it yourself. The information's there. The tools for education are in front of you. We've made sure of it. The resources are there. And just one final plug before I give you the floor, closing comments, Robert. One final plug is that this website, if you want a direct copy of it, we'll put it onto USB and we'll mail it to you. You can actually make a donation through our bookshop website, veritasbooks.com.au, to cover it, and it'll be on its way within 24 hours. So the entire website, all those thousands of books that we've got there, all those thousands of documents, multiple thousands of documents are there at your disposal for you to educate, to edify, to actually show you the road out of this COVID lockdown, of this world tyranny, of this great reset. Not as a year zero, but as a year 2021 of our Lord. Your closing comments, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, just another note on COVID. I heard last week that studies have indicated that people who are obese have 3 times worse infection rates of COVID. And yet in the United States, people are being encouraged to get vaccinations by being promised free hamburgers and fries. That was by the mayor of New York, de Blasio, who looked absolutely ridiculous when eating this hamburger. I'm sure he doesn't eat too many hamburgers. And another promotion was giving you 2 donuts a day for a week. And yet obesity is a major contributory factor in COVID infections, to the extent that they're real at all, and that even that is in question. Anyway, we're having some interesting developments in politics in Canada. We're in the middle of an election. Our Prime Minister, who thinks of himself as a very attractive, charming individual, has been harried by the electorate. He's been chased out of 3 venues and more or less fled. Something different from his father. His father was also very socialistically inclined, but he had a real backbone. And if he was challenged by a mob, he would stand up to it. But his son is a miserable coward. He just runs away. Anyway, the other day, it got so extreme that somebody was throwing little rocks at him. So Canadians generally are pretty placid, civil individuals. But I think there's so much frustration in society now that we're at a point where we might have some uh, some interesting political developments. It's not going to happen in this election. People are being told you've got these three old parties. In Canada, we've got the New Democratic Party, which is socialist. We've got the Liberal Party, which is socialist. And we've got the Conservative Party, which is socialist. And they all compete in being the most socialist. The Conservatives would deny it, but they're the ones who have criticized the Liberals for not doing enough to fight this COVID thing. So if the likelihood now is that they will be elected and maybe even get a majority, in which case nothing will change except things will get worse faster, I think. But anyway, that's what we're faced with. Now, there are a couple of marginal parties that have come along, and they are making the pitch that if you vote for any of these the major parties, then you're just going to perpetuate the situation that has become so intolerable. And they can make that argument. But I was just watching an interview of the leader of one of these parties, a fellow named Maxime Bernier. Maxime Bernier was asked if he believed that there were string pullers behind the political structure, if there was such a thing as a deep state. And he said, no, I don't believe that at all. Well, I'm not sure he would get much agreement from anybody these days. I think even the least politically inclined people in the world would be suspicious that there's something very strange going on behind politics. So he has, I think, really discredited himself by pretending that there are no arcane influences in politics. It's so obvious there are. And in fact, I met this man, Maxime Bernier, and shook his hand. And we were just about to engage in some sort of conversation. But I said, this country needs to reform its financial system. And I tell you, he made a beeline to talk to somebody else. This was not a topic that he wanted to get involved in. So don't count on any political party to pull you out of this mess. There's going to have to be a lot of pressure from below on all parties and on all politicians in order for the influence from beneath to counteract and overcome the influence of the deep state that all these people deny exists. So there we go. Politics in Canada. I shouldn't be laughing because it's actually a dire situation. There's just no alternative that you can see. And if you test any of these people, they all are glorious failures.
Mm. Thank you for that, Robert. I'll just remind our viewers that every opportunity, especially in Australia with preferential voting, is to put the sitting member last in your voting. And that way, even if you don't know who to vote for, you do know who to vote against. And that to me is very important, because this by putting the sitting member last, what you're actually doing is you're having a veto. You're vetoing the existing policy. And that to me is fundamental, that you actually think in your mind's eye, what don't I like? Or what do I like? Well, we always, what do I like? I'm going to choose whatever bribes they offer me. But seriously, what is it that you don't like? Well, this bloke's full-blown communist, totalitarian lockdown. Okay, right, he is last. He's the sitting member. He's actually part of the representative swill that's there, that I get no say in, no opportunity. Well, he's going last, and I think that is a very important strategy. So don't think that your vote is wasted. A negative vote is still an effective vote, because if you can turn over politicians every election, that in itself is a good thing, is a better thing than what we're actually experiencing, because they get entrenched. They're on the trough. I say the trough, the gravy train of the never of the payments that they receive, the perks that they receive, the benefits that they derive while being in the parliament. That's the trough, and they're just in there like swine. and they won't. They will sit and swallow in it. They'll wallow in it. They won't move. So yes, put the sitting member last. I think that's at least a starting strategy. But yes, the issues are daily issues. They don't actually come up once every 3 or 4 years. They come up every day. But on the basis that you do have a say, you can do something. But then you've also got to consider, what can I do in between elections? What can I do? And that's the area of information. You can build up your knowledge. You can actually inform others. You can actually consolidate those things that you learn and produce a brochure, pamphlet, a newspaper. Consolidate them and then distribute them out into the community. In the Soviet era, underground, they had Samizdat being precious written information that they handed out one sheet at a time. They handed it out one sheet at a time, and you were meant not to throw it in the fire, but hand it on. Samizdat. Very, very important, because that sort of information, that sort of, if you like, perspective of the value of truth, that to me is important, because it's the truth that will set you free. And Douglas said something that was most profound, and I think it's important in the summary of today, and that is, if a problem is correctly stated, it is already half solved. It is already half solved if it's correctly stated. And that is our objective at the Crossroads, is to state the problems correctly and then offer some form of solutions or considerations. I really appreciate your input, Robert, every week. I appreciate the fact that you're loyal and reliable, and I really also have to acknowledge that Wally has worked this thing through, all the way through to his rundown of his health, and it's very much appreciated what you Canadians contribute to the Crossroads.
Wally has been promoting social credit for probably 65 years. And it has actually been the center of his life. He's given himself to it, as so many people who have been key to the movement have. You know, there was a politician, he's a politician, so unfortunately, I don't like to quote politicians, but this one said, people keep asking me how I can get hold of social credit. And he said, you don't get hold of social credit, it gets hold of you.
That's right.
And this is true. All these people who have devoted their lives to bringing common sense to our financial arrangements.
Excellent.
Recognizing it is so important that it was worth devoting their life to.
That's right. Exactly right. I agree. Thank you so much, Robert. And ladies and gentlemen, this is Arnis Luks at the Crossroads. Cheers then.
Thanks, Arnie.